Well, welcome everybody to a For Immediate Release interview. There haven't been any of these in about 3.5 years, and we're very happy to revive FIR interviews with our very special guests, Andrea Weckerle and Jolie O'Dell. And we're here to talk about CiviliNation. If you go way back into the FIR archives, you will find a previous interview with Andrea on this topic. Back when it was relatively new, and now it has progressed and evolved, and Jolie has been named the new president. So my first question is, tell me what's been going on for the last few years with CiviliNation, and how did the new president come about?
Yeah, so the last several years, we've been busy trying to stem the tide of misinformation and disinformation and be a voice of reason in the very heated online space, both nationally and globally. And our tone probably became a little bit sharper because we felt a need to speak out and make sure that people were aware of what was happening online, and also try to convince them of the importance of stepping up and taking a stand on issues within a framework, of course, that allowed people to have diverse opinions about particular topics, hard topics. But that's what we've been doing for the past several years. And as it came up on, we've been around for about 10 years now. And as it came up on our anniversary, I approached the board and I said, you know what, we're at a new phase in the country now. We're looking forward to hopefully a reunification in certain circles. And I think it's time to pass the baton to somebody with new ideas, fresh ideas. I know there are some founders who stay on forever within their organizations or their companies because it has been their baby and they've nurtured it and they're afraid to let go. But I thought the best thing for the organization would be to bring somebody else on. So what we did, we spoke to a handful of really, really wonderful, competent, interested people. But Jolie stood out for a bunch of reasons, and we laid everything out for her, and she was up for the challenge. So we're absolutely delighted that she is here. And I continue to work for the organization as a vice president. Now I continue to be on the board, but Jolie is definitely at the helm. So if there are any questions about where CiviliNation is going to be going, the future of CiviliNation, she is the person to ask about that.
That's a good recap. I mean, I remember the interview in 2010. Shel did that one, and that's a decade ago. We also did, I recall, a book review of a book you wrote when Bob LeDrew was our book editor at the time. That must have been about 2013, Shel, somewhere like that.
Sounds right.
So you've been sort of part of developments over the years. I guess my first question, probably for you mostly, Andrea, but I think Jolie might have an opinion on this too. It's a very broad question, I have to say, but I thought this might get some conversation points going. But I was wondering, there's so many things happening in the world that are right in your area of interest, and all of our areas of interest, in fact. And indeed, Jolie, I saw your tweet earlier. You pointed out a page on your blog that you wrote about some events recently, particularly Burger King in the UK is a very good example on the misstep they made. And of course, we've got the whole Meghan and Harry thing and the uproar surrounding all of that that's still reverberating everywhere. So that's kind of big scale. And I'm just wondering, tell me if you think it's a dumb question, by the way, but it's a very broad one, which is basically, how has this whole thing of online harassment and abuse and all that stuff changed over the 10 years of CiviliNation, do you think? Because what you were advocating against, so getting people to pay attention a decade ago, is that the same today, or has it changed?
So I think the principles are the same. What we were trying to do is really, in a sense, talk about accountability, responsibility, ethics, and, you know, I'm throwing a lot in the pot here, but really get people to be aware of how they contribute to online discourse, and also really focus on freedom of speech and what that means, and reframing it from a purely legal argument that if something is allowed online, that should be the standard we use. If it's allowed online, it's okay to do or say, which is a very, very low standard, in my opinion, to saying, wait a minute, let's look constructively at how we can make the internet a ideal environment for giving everybody a voice. The point I made earlier, giving everybody I think I'm kind of kicking out there, giving everybody a voice online and be able to advance conversations about difficult social issues or political issues or whatnot. I know 10 years ago, social networks weren't as advanced as they are now. They weren't as ubiquitous. And as a result, some people were still figuring out where they had a role or where they could engage online and so forth. But now if there was never a question before, social media has become inextricably intertwined into daily life. You really can't get away from it. So the question is, how are we going to advance a conversation, or are we going to devolve the way we did in the past, let's say 5 years? And you still see a lot of the same behavior and actors online. But what do we do about this? Because it's not, your question was, has it remained the same? Is it worse? What's the standard? I think it's gotten worse. I think it's gotten worse as more people are online. I think it's gotten worse as social networks and other media platforms are focusing even more on page views, to heck with anything else, and the more extreme and emotionally laden, the better. And I think people have become enormously emotionally manipulated online. So there's a point, and I want to give Jolie to talk about a chance to talk about this in a second, but the manipulation is a huge problem. And then also the fact that people aren't educating themselves about media or news literacy, and as a result are becoming, or allowing themselves to a certain extent, to become emotionally hijacked. So I look at it from two different angles, what the problem is and where we need to go with that. Does that answer your question, Neville? Or
it's a great intro, and that leads to at least 5 more questions, but Shel has one, I know.
Well, I wanted to give Jolie a chance to add to what Andrea said.
Thank you so much. I think I look at my own evolution over the past 4 or 5 years in particular, and I noticed how, as an individual and as a member of the media, the way I was communicating online became so heightened, and everything that was political became so personal. And I realized that both as someone who has a voice as a member of the media and as a consumer of media, I was getting very, very caught up and very invested in things that I shouldn't have been. And I think it kind of goes back to, national and international media political discourse. When you have Joy Reid or Tucker Carlson saying, well, the half of the country that doesn't think like you, they're evil and they're stupid and they're trying to destroy your way of life. And they might be a little bit more subtle about it. They might not. But then we kind of go into our interactions online thinking, oh, if this individual that I can't see, who I've never met, if they disagree with me, they're out to get my way of life. They're going to make my daughter have an abortion. They're going to turn my son gay, or, they're going to make me go to church, whatever. And it's just not so. And I really wish we could all turn down the spice, turn down the volume, and start to see each other as people of good faith again.
So what direction can the organization go in order to have an effect on this kind of dialogue and discourse that we're engaged in pretty much worldwide? Certainly, it was not anywhere near this level of vitriol 10 years ago when we did the interview and things were just kicking off with CiviliNation. How do you go forward in order to really have an impact?
I think right now is the perfect time. People are so hungry for some kind of peace. We are all exhausted from arguing. Our cortisol and adrenaline levels are up here all the time. We're having imaginary arguments in the shower day in, day out. So I think people are really ready to say, okay, what can I do to put a stop to this madness, to get my friendships, my family, my online discourse back on track? And I think CiviliNation is also in a great position to put pressure on media to get rid of a lot of that leading emotional language and the gatekeeping that keeps people stuck in their biases and prevents them from having their own unique, diverse thoughts. People really need to be encouraged to think for themselves.
Yeah, I mean, that's well said, Jolie. I mean, I think to Shel's point earlier as well, that's totally connected with that things have definitely got worse. The thing that I don't get, and is it a facet of human behavior? Maybe that's it. In which case, the next question related to that, of course, is can we do anything about it? Which is basically that if you are in a discussion, to what Andrea was saying as well, online, let's say in Facebook, a Facebook group could be, it might not be, it could be something on Twitter, and people pile in left, right, and center with abuse, with vile language, accusations of this, that, and the other, and it seems unstoppable. And so that leads to my question, which is something I'm very interested in, that is something that I think is a kind of missing piece of the puzzle, related to calls for the likes of Facebook, Twitter, social networks, etc., to do something about this. All initial caps, that phrase, by the way. And of course, that they're just one stakeholder in all of this, an important one without doubt. And I wonder what governments, policymakers, regulators, social networks, and everyone else who has a stake in all this, which means the users as well, need to do about this. Because all this talk, we must do something about it. And the Harry and Meghan one is a very good example of the online abuse that I saw when I was looking particularly to see what people were saying about them was staggering. I mean, truly, I was shocked at some of this stuff. And I'm thinking, I bet you some of the stuff I saw on Twitter still is there. I bet you. I mean, they've not taken this down. And that strays into the area of, well, freedom of speech, or terms and conditions and all that. These are all excuses, it seems to me. But it does seem to me, too, that those primary actors, let's call them that, the governments, the policymakers, the regulators, the social networks, need to work together and find a solution. And I hear that said a lot. So why can't we do that? I guess that's the question. Why can't we do anything about it?
Well, I think there are two aspects that we need to consider. One is free speech, and I'll talk about that in a second. The other is, to Andrea's point, more about personal ethical obligation as individuals. Most of us have some guiding principle that inspires us to respect each other, whether it's the golden rule or the principle of universal human equality, we're all created equal, or if it's a more religious sentiment, like we're all children of God. If we can tap into that when we feel ourselves get stressed and emotional and conflicted online, I think that could vastly change things. Now, when you go to free speech, I was thinking about this yesterday. Free speech is like walking around with no pants on. It's great. You can do it in your own home as much as you want. In some places, like in San Francisco, you can do it on the city street. There's a group of gay men in the Castro who will just walk out on the street with, a sock around their cash and prizes because that's their free speech right. But can you do that at a Wendy's? No, it's not your free speech right anymore because, as was said in my household growing up, my house, my rules. So I think Twitter and Facebook need to get people to put their pants back on their platforms and adopt a little bit of, this is our house. We foot the bills. We pay for the servers. We do have rules, and show some backbone, show some ethical standards when it comes to enforcing those things. Because if the house rules at Twitter are, you can bash anybody as long as it doesn't technically break the law, that's not a house I want to be in.
I have a question, but we do actually have somebody watching the YouTube stream, our friend Chip Griffin, who says, if each half believes the other half is wrong, how can government and social media platforms actually implement protections that don't make things worse? Everyone is biased, even the regulators and platform owners, and will make decisions from their own point of view. I'd like to get perspectives from both of you on that.
Andrea, you want to kick it off?
I was looking at you. You were looking at me like, who's going to take this one? what I'd like to see is, there's different approaches to this. One could be the legislative approach, right? You're going to create a rule around something and then say, this is the rule we have to follow. And the other thing would be to have a campaign around something and say, this is an idea we want to propose from, let's say, a government's position. So for example, I don't want to talk about this, but the vaccine, right? There's the ability to get a vaccine, and there's also campaigns to try to get people to want to take the vaccine, trust the vaccine, and so forth, right? So one is more regulatory, one is more perhaps campaign-like. And if all the governments would come out and start having a campaign the way they do with a bunch of other policy things, that would be a good start. That would be a good start without being heavy-handed initially and saying, wait a minute, this is what you can and can't do. Obviously, there are parameters around this. Hate speech is disallowed, defamation is disallowed, and so on and so forth. But generally, in the United States, we have an enormously broad arena within which we get to do things online, and that can be really, really good because it does get in diverse opinions, but the nuance by those who scream the loudest or have particular agendas they want to promote, it often gets hijacked by these folks. So what I'd like to see is governments have a campaign saying, wait a minute, let's all do X, or let's move into the direction of X, and do it in a great way to get the buy-in of the population. Obviously, there's always going to be some folks who don't want to buy in anything. I mean, you pick any issue, any industry, it doesn't matter. There's always going to be people who are extremely polarized, have particular agendas they want to push, and they don't diverge from those whatsoever. But most of the people fall somewhere in the center, and those are the people that you can talk with. Those are the people you should invest your time on and say, wait a minute, let's talk about what we're doing online. So for example, one of the things at CiviliNation that we recommend people do is if they have a social media presence, and most do, and if they've done something that they no longer stand behind online, let's say it's a tweet from a few years ago, or a Facebook post, or a comment, please, for goodness sake, go back and see what you've done. I mean, it doesn't preclude anybody from screenshotting what you've done and then saying later on, wait a minute, you did this, and in which case, you got to step up and say, I screwed up royally. But at the very least, it means that you're no longer standing behind something. Now, I know there are some people who will argue, wait a minute, it's part of history and I should leave it on there. I think that's bad advice. I think go in and clean it up, because if I saw something on somebody's Twitter feed that was objectionable, I would think they still stand behind that. If not, why not take it down? And if it is something that needs to be addressed, then come out and say that, apologize. Don't later on say, well, I've changed from 10 years ago or 5 years ago, whatever the case may be. Go out and say, wait a minute, I have learned from that. And mean it sincerely, not one of those bullshit PR arguments. If I have offended somebody, first of all, the if part has got to go. You offended somebody, you did it, stand behind it, and move on from there. People tend to be very, very forgiving if somebody has stepped up, taken responsibility and accountability. We're more often than not willing to give most people a second chance. So do that. But those are some of the ideas that I have around that issue. But Jolie.
Yeah, I mean, I completely concur with what Andrea has said, in terms especially of not educating people, but appealing to what people already know is good for everybody and good for them individually. As I said before, I think people are tired of arguing, are looking for some sense of normalcy and peace. And it's like we all have this consensus that texting and driving is bad. We all sometimes do it. But, you can see road signs, don't text and drive. If we could come to some consensus that, oh yeah, arguing online feels bad. Ad hominem attacks feel bad when it happens to me and when I say it to someone else. Right now, I would say about 50% I did a Twitter poll the other day, 50% of folks said when they get in an argument online, respectful disagreement feels best in the long run. That's only half. The other half, a third of them said getting a sick burn in feels great in the long run, and 15-20% of them were more of the opinion that getting the last word was what counted most. So I think if we can educate people on how and why respectful disagreement is better for the individual involved in the argument, that could go a long way. It lowers your stress level. You're not going to be up thinking about it late at night 2 weeks later. And it really does help you build your own character by recalling your moral center, that principle that guides you to respect yourself and other people. We all have that. Unless you're a sociopath, you've got that somewhere inside.
So everyone has a role then. I think what I'm hearing from that, and I agree with that. I think the educational element is great. The worry I have is that not everyone is reasonable. So your poll's a good example, Jolie. 50% said the good answer. What about the other 50%? So plus, we've got different countries, different cultures, different jurisdictions legally. So how do you implement this, given that these are what we're talking about, are global methods of connecting and communicating? And when push comes to shove and something happens that is equivalent of either libel or defamation or whatever the terms might be in one country, that's not in another. And so you enter the conundrum, perhaps. I remember these discussions back in the early days of social media, that who has responsibility for the blog post you wrote that offended someone? You're in the UK, that person's in Germany, the server's in Alaska. Well, it wouldn't be, it'd probably be in North Carolina or somewhere. And another element of it, the platform you're using is actually in Australia. So which jurisdiction applies? And I don't think that should deter anyone, but those are real issues, it seems to me. So maybe this needs to be done on a not an ad hoc basis, but one country at a time, maybe. But someone's got to start this, and this is the thing. So how do we marshal this? How do we organize this? This is I suppose, a dilemma. Or is it someone will do something that we all like, and that's the model? I've not seen that yet, though. That's the thing.
I don't think you can really, it is a global problem and there's no global governmental solution. I think that this, kind of like the principle of human equality, that all people are created equal, this is becoming a global premise. It isn't currently in a lot of places, but it's getting there. It's very slow. It takes hundreds of years to take hold, but eventually I believe someday on the planet, almost everybody will believe that all people are created equal. All people deserve respect. That is a huge concept, and getting people to not just believe it, but live by it. That's not something you can legislate. You can try, but I think the fulfillment of that belief you see over a long period of time and a groundswell of people. I have great faith in Gen Z for this, by the way. Millennials are way too freaked out and paranoid about, boomers taking our life away. But I believe in youth, actually, to choose kindness and respect, to model kindness and respect in ways that people who are older and more cynical and more easily triggered, we just sometimes don't have the patience for it anymore. But I think young people are doing a really great job of modeling respect and human kindness online. When you talked about the pile-on, it's really unusual to see those de-escalate, but I've seen so many great examples of young people very thoughtfully stepping in to an online dog pile and saying, hey, wait, let's unpack this because I think you meant this. And I think and like kind of connecting the pieces in terms of active listening for other people. And they're just heroes.
I'd also like to add that if you see something you don't like online, there's a difference between responding and reacting. And we need to move away from reacting to something and focus on the responding. And, you may think that's just semantics, but one has to do with being in control of yourself emotionally as much as possible. If you see something that you vehemently, passionately disagree with, particularly if it's a values-based thing. But something that we found very useful in teaching people is focusing on the if, when, and how. And the if starts with, do you need to respond? Then when do you need to respond, and the how. And people assume that if they see something that they disagree with online, they right away need to jump in. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. I'm giving the lawyer answer as it depends, but it does depend on the situation, the facts, and the specificity. But But if it's something where somebody's just being a jackass, and there's no further traction there, then, just let it go. Or if it's on Facebook, what you can do is basically switch on the setting where the person still thinks their comment exists, but it's basically invisible to anybody else, right? So you're not triggering them by deleting their comment as such, but nobody else can see it. And so there's not going to be this influx of more emotionality. That's one cool little trick on Facebook, at least. But if you do need to respond, then think about when. Do you do it right away, later? And then how? How is so critical. You shouldn't just go on and say, well, wait a minute, you're a jerk. And maybe the person is a jerk, because you disagree with me on X, Y, Z. And there are plenty of people I think are jerks. And I have to admit, even though this is what I focus on in my work. I mean, it's still hard for me, but I try to show that self-restraint and say, okay, what am I going to add to the conversation? Or am I just going to make myself feel better for 2 seconds? Am I going to escalate things? And then, what is it going to happen? So to think about not just what I'm doing right now, but what is the long-term effect of what I'm doing? So if, when, and how, let's build that into our online discourse as well.
There is a hedonistic pleasure to getting a sick burn in, but I think when people learn through experience that as good as it feels to say something snarky and correct that everyone you love agrees with, it feels so much better to walk away with respect for yourself and other people. And that pleasure lasts a very long time.
The distinction, Andrea, that you propose between reacting and responding is probably part of the answer to this question. I'm reading a book of essays right now, and one of the essays is dedicated to the proposition that civility is a mistake. That if we are civil, it means we are saying something other than what we think. We're not being authentic. We are not sharing what we really believe. And I'd like you to respond to that and maybe define what civility means in the context of the work of this organization.
So anybody who knows me very well or has spent any amount of time with me knows that I have strong views about particular things, extremely strong views, and views that maybe not everybody agrees with, but that I stand behind. But you won't generally find me going online and throwing a firebomb into a conversation. I may share my views, but I'll do it in a way that engages others or that allows others to recognize that while this is my view, I am open for a discussion and also open, in fact, to modifying my views about passionately held beliefs on particular topics. So I think there is a way of moving forward. And your question about civility. So what civility does not mean to CiviliNation is being polite and not offending and always being nice. And the phrase I always used to like to use is, we're not about pink ponies and rainbows, right? I can disagree with you about things and I can have a passionate discussion. But my goal is not to eviscerate you. For 2 reasons, because I think it's a shitty thing to do. As I tell my kids, do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. Not because it's easy, not because it's comfortable, not because it feels good, but because it's the right thing to do. And the other thing is, if I'm having a conversation with you and I tear you down, I have sure as heck not convinced you of anything whatsoever. So if my goal is to be a jerk online, fine. Okay, maybe my crazy followers say, yeah, she's really showed Shel. She's really beat him down and gotten him to quiet down and doxed him and all this other crazy stuff. But if I want to promote my idea or my passions or whatever the case is, then I've got to build an environment of trust that allows people to recognize that their views and the things that they say will resonate with me to the extent that I will consider them openly and fairly. And so civility for us means giving everybody a voice online even if we disagree with, and advancing the conversation in such a way that people feel free to converse about difficult issues. It does not mean taking away their voice. I mean, for us, that's really, really critical. Civility means not tearing people apart where they are afraid to engage online and as a result leave. Because if that's the case, we've shut them down. That is not freedom of speech at all.
It's a difficult one, isn't it? I mean, in America, you've had 4 years of aggressive behavior in the real world and online, particularly online. I think that has reflected in the growth of that kind of behavior, where it's all absolutes, right? If you disagree with me, therefore you hate me and you're going to try and kill me or something, and it stokes anger. And you look at some of the discourse online that is so, this is not polite conversation. So the way you've explained that, Andrew, I think is extremely good, because it is about being civil. You can disagree, but you don't, in your words, eviscerate the other person, right? I mean, you can disagree and advance the discussion, because surely the goal must be to find some kind of common ground where, or actually maybe not. You agree to disagree, perhaps, ultimately, depending on what it is. But this is what civilization is about, is it not? We're civilized people. I mean, that often is a philosophical discussion, but we've come to a bad place, it seems to me, generally, and we've got to try and bring it back to a reasonable place to be in, I think.
To piggyback off of this, I know if I have so many friends, and I myself am probably super duper liberal. As a queer person also, my identity and my politics are so necessarily intertwined. The personal is very political for me, and the political is very, very personal. And so I know in the past, especially when I thought about trying to find common ground with people who support re-education camps for queer teenagers, it's such a stretch. But I also have learned over time that you further polarize those people and harm your own chance of making progress with them if you can't exercise enough psychological flexibility to widen that circle of conversation so that people don't feel threatened just to talk to you. And I really think, I could get eviscerated for this, but I really feel like being able to take those deeply held personal beliefs and extricate them from your identity just enough to hold them out and examine them and share them calmly with other people and explain calmly, this is why I believe this is why I feel that way. And if you don't feel the same way, that's okay for you. That's democracy. That's diversity. You're allowed to think something different. As long as you are not doing, bullying, harassment, ad hominem attacks. We can have so many conversations about queer identities, abortion, vaccines, you name it. We could talk about Donald Trump all the live long day. If we could just get our really clenched, emotional, personal feelings a little separated from those topics that we need to talk about together.
Jolie, I'm curious. I've been following you as a journalist for many years. I always look forward to reading your work on VentureBeat. How does your experience as a journalist, how will that help you in this role as president of CiviliNation?
Well, I think media is such an interesting voice in what's going on with the level of discourse. And, when I graduated from J School in 2004, it was, how many column inches did you write this week? And, did you create the most neutral article that gives people the information? And did you use the inverted pyramid? And then when I got into online newsrooms, it was, how many clicks did it get? Did it get picked up by insert name of big news aggregator here? And so many times, I did this with the people I was editing as well. You create a headline that's a little bit misleading, or you throw in a quote that explains your point of view and you don't balance out that quote with another quote from another expert who disagrees, but still has a salient, valid point. And so one of the things that I can really address from the inside, from an insider perspective, is bias in the media and how it just entrenches people in their views till we get more and more and more polarized. And people have to knock that off, and media really has to knock it off.
Can we take a look at the just briefly the discussion around the blog post that appeared on the CiviliNation website, "Branded Harassment"? Great title. When brands start the conversation, haters take over. It highlights a number of examples, but one I was aware of because I saw this unfolding here in the UK on Burger King and what they did. Can you just talk us through what happened here? Because they seem to have fixed what they did. That seems to have gained approval, as it were, but I'm not sure where this has left them overall, because I still see negativity out there about what they did. I don't believe they were attempting to do so. I think they screwed up royally. So just what was all that about, basically?
Oh, well, in a nutshell, for people who aren't aware of what happened, Burger King on International Women's Day tweeted, "A woman's place is in the kitchen." Now, this is a thread. The next tweet says, if that's where they want to be, not enough chefs, executive chef level people in kitchens are women. So there's some disparity there, and we're having scholarship programs to put women in those positions. And it was crafted in a way that was intended to be controversial and edgy and get attention. That is a marketing tactic. Unfortunately, it created a PR problem because an awful lot of people used that first tweet, didn't read the rest, and used it as an excuse to bash women, abuse, harass, bully women. And oh my stars, I think they got it wrong when they didn't have a PR person or a woman who felt free to be vocal, or a male feminist person in the room who couldn't speak up and say, maybe don't nest that second tweet. Maybe put it all in the first one so there's no way to misinterpret it. But yeah, I think it goes so far before the tweet and before the response to the tweet. Get the right people in the room and let everybody have a voice when you're going to do something edgy with your marketing.
I wrote a post years ago after hearing a Freakonomics podcast about failure. In fact, it featured Alan McDonald, who just passed away a few days ago. He was the Morton Thiokol engineer who would not sign off on the launch of the Space Shuttle Challenger because of the temperature at launch, and refused to do so and resisted all of the pressure. But it led to a discussion about anticipating failure as a stage that a lot of organizations don't go through. And I proposed that in the communication strategic planning process, right at launch, everybody should take a step back and say, okay, let's project ourselves out 6 months. This has failed. What went wrong? And they might have identified that standalone tweet would have caused some serious problems if they had done that. I do have one last question I want to ask you, but first, Chip shared a thought that I wanted to read to you and get your reaction to. He says, the current environment drives the idea that there's no such thing as opinion, only right and wrong is not just wrong, but evil. Evil certainly exists, but too much gets lumped into the category, and it does indeed shut down meaningful dialogue and could actually lead to change. Any thoughts?
It's absolutely true. Again, I think because the gulf between conservative and liberal bias has grown so vast, it is hard to say, oh yeah, there's nuance. There's nuance to my belief. I differ from other liberals in what I believe. I align with some conservatives on what I believe, because we are all of us on a spectrum. You can be far from someone on a spectrum, but you can still find common ground. And evil, actual evil, is out there, and it is so rare to find a truly evil person who wants to destroy others. I think it's a very difficult but very helpful exercise to search for nuance and common ground in the people you thought you had the least in common with.
And that's where I keep pushing on the importance of critical thinking, right? Be aware of what your beliefs are but at the same time, be really, really aware of what your biases are. I'm aware of what mine are. Some I can feel that I can justify. Others are the ones where I'm like, okay, that's just, it doesn't make any sense. And I fight against those literally every single day. I mean, it's nothing earth shattering, but particular things that just rub me the wrong way. And I'm like, okay, I'm not going to react based on these harmful biases. And so that goes back to the point, that Jolie and I were talking about personal responsibility. I mean, we're not saying that platforms don't need to change things, the governments don't need to step in about certain things, and so on and so forth, the media. But what can all of us do? We are in control of ourselves, and start thinking critically, realize why you think certain things, and open up the door for the notion that you are probably not right about every single thing you believe. It takes
Whew.
enormous courage to yourself and towards others to say, you know what, I'm wrong about something. Doesn't mean you have to say it on Twitter or Facebook, but in your circle, in your trusted circle, say, you're right. This is a valid point. And if you start practicing that, it gets easier, I promise. And then hopefully, if more people do this, it opens that aspect of trust that I was talking about. Shel, if you and I disagree with something, and I'm not being an a-hole about how I express it, you may be more willing to listen to what I have to say and to consider its validity, or at least recognize my different point of view on something, than if I'm sitting there and beating up on you continuously. Then you're just going to put me in a box and say, you know what, I don't want to deal with her because she's just unreasonable and ugly and nasty type of thing. So if you are willing and courageous enough to say, hey, guess what? Let me constantly examine my own views about something. That's an enormously important step that all of us should be making on a regular basis.
So I had a final question. You've actually answered it already, Andrea, actually, about what can each of us do. So my question instead then, as a final one from me, is this is great, but some people will struggle with this because they don't know how, they don't feel confident they can. So what would you say to those people? Can they get help from somewhere? There's no kind of place they can go to. What should people who think, well, this is reasonable and I'm going to try and do this, but I don't know how to start doing that. What would you say to them?
We are actually in the process of creating a bunch of tools for, I don't want to use the word consumers, it's so capitalist, but people, normal, everyday humans on the internet, to examine bias, to recognize it, to recognize even just in your own body, when you get that rush of cortisol and you feel enraged, to recognize what that feels like. I think that is always the first step, to know yourself and listen to your gut. And when your intuition says, oh, this person just pissed me off with his head, take a breath and remind yourself, wait a second, I believe that whatever your core belief is, people are inherently good, or everyone was created equal. I believe that. I'm going to take a second and I'm going to sit with that thought. I'm going to apply it to this person who just pissed me off. And then I'm going to say something to show that I'm a person of good faith, to inspire that person, not to change their mind, but just to say, oh, maybe they're reasonable. Maybe I don't have to use attacks. And I think one person choosing to de-escalate and say, wait, let's slow this down. Let's make sure we're understanding each other. Maybe we have something in common. One person doing that, it's like a beautiful wet blanket on a little fire. It just takes the burn away.
Also, I think most people who say or do something that sparks outrage came from a place of decent intent and miscalculated how they were approaching it. I was looking at your directors, and I noticed that Jimmy Wales is still one of your directors. He was there at the founding, the founder of, or co-founder, I should say, of Wikipedia. But I also noticed that Cami Watson-Heise is there, and Neville and I have known Cami going way back to the founding of the Society for New Communication Research. What's the role of the directors, and what do they contribute to your efforts?
Well, Cami actually contributed quite a bit to that blog post. It's a blog post of consensus. I feel like everyone on that board is so experienced and intelligent and well connected. And right now, as we're going through some transitions, and we're also making sure that our focus is really aligned with what people need right now, we're kind of operating like a little brains trust and saying like, okay, what can we do? What can we come up with to help people? How can we put pressure on media? And we're writing and we're making calls and we're forming committees. We've been very, very busy over the past few weeks, and we will have a lot more to share very soon.
Oh, we'll keep an eye out for that. I
Mm.
want to thank you both for the time.
Thank you,
It's been
Michelle.
terrific.
Thank you.
It has
Yeah.
indeed.
Terrific. Thank you.